the battle that shattered Saddam's capital. As the sun began to rise on April 5, 2003, over the war-scarred plains of Iraq, a low rumble stirred across the desert horizon. It wasn't the wind. It was armor, hundreds of tons of American steel, alive with noise and purpose. M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and Humvees grumbled into position, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the dawn air like smoke before a fire. The desert shimmered under the early light, but nothing about this day was calm. The soldiers of the U.S. Army's 2nd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division, tightened their flak vests, checked their rifles, and looked north toward Baghdad, a city that loomed in both myth and menace, where statues of Saddam Hussein still towered over shattered streets, and the regime's black-uniformed Fedayeen fighters waited in the shadows. This was not how battles for capitals were supposed to be fought. Traditionally, armies surrounded cities, laid siege, softened defenses, then advanced block by block, house by house, in grinding urban warfare. But not this time. This time, American commanders had authorized something radical. A thunder run. A high-speed armored raid straight into the heart of Baghdad. Not to seize it, not yet, but to strike it like a thunderclap, to demonstrate to the regime, to its troops, and to the world that Saddam no longer held his capital with impunity, that U.S. forces could roll through the gates of the city at will. It was audacious, risky, some called it reckless. The plan was to take Task Force 164 armor, a battalion of roughly 30 Abrams tanks and 14 Bradleys, and charge up Highway 8, the main southern artery, into Baghdad, like a steel spear into the enemy's chest. They would push all the way to Saddam International Airport on the western edge of the city, assess enemy reaction, then fall back. If it succeeded, it could shock the Iraqi command structure into paralysis. If it failed, it would leave dozens of American soldiers trapped inside a hostile city with no backup, cut off and surrounded. At 6 a.m., the order came. Engines growled, radios crackled, and the lead tanks rolled forward. The landscape changed quickly. Flat desert gave way to the outer slums of Baghdad, a mix of cinderblock homes, auto repair shops, and industrial lots. At first, the streets were eerily quiet. Then, from alleyways and rooftops, the Fedayeen struck. RPGs screamed in from all sides. Machine gun fire rattled from windows. Black-clad fighters sprinted across intersections, launching ambushes and disappearing into buildings. They weren't regular army. They were irregulars, fanatics loyal to Saddam, who fought without fear and often without coordination. But the Abrams tanks were built for this. With 120mm smoothbore cannons, layered composite armor, and thermal sights, they punched through every ambush. A single tank shell could level a building. Bradleys poured out 25mm cannon fire and tow missiles. The convoy pushed forward, carving through resistance with brute force and momentum. Infantry dismounted to clear intersections, then jumped back aboard to maintain the pace. By midday, they had reached the airport, a sprawling complex once meant to showcase Saddam's vision of modern Iraq. Now it lay in ruins, craters, smoke, shattered terminals. The task force paused, regrouped, and evaluated. Mission accomplished. But the day was far from over. Retracing their path, the Americans now faced an even greater challenge: getting back out. The road they had used to enter was no longer empty. It was now a gauntlet. Iraqi fighters, stunned by the morning assault, had scrambled reinforcements. Mortars dropped from the sky. Technicals, pickup trucks with machine guns mounted in the bed, darted in and out of side streets. RPGs rained down from overpasses. One by one, American vehicles were hit. A Bradley erupted in flames. A Humvee was immobilized. Dismounted infantry engaged in running gunfights, sometimes just yards from enemy combatants. Yet the Americans pressed on, dragging damaged vehicles, coordinating air support, laying suppressive fire. Apache helicopters darted overhead, strafing enemy positions. F-16s screamed past, dropping precision bombs where resistance was heaviest. The convoy inched south, battered but unbroken. By nightfall, they were back outside the city, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. The raid had lasted less than 12 hours. But in those 12 hours, the myth of Baghdad's invincibility had been shattered. Iraqi command was in disarray. Communications were broken. Fedayeen morale was shaken. The Thunder Run had pierced not just the city's defenses, but the illusion that Saddam could control the battlefield. American commanders saw the effect, and they began planning the final blow. What had begun as a tactical gamble became a turning point. 2 days later, the U.S. launched a second, larger Thunder Run, this time not just to raid Baghdad, but to take it, and this time they would not leave. But it was on April 5th, during that first bold strike, that the world witnessed something extraordinary. The sheer velocity and violence of modern mechanized warfare unleashed in an urban setting. A single battalion fighting through a capital city of 5 million people, demonstrating what American armor, speed, and shock power could do. For Saddam, it was the beginning of the end. For the people of Baghdad, it was the arrival of a new and uncertain era. And for the soldiers of the 2nd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division, it was a day they would never forget, a day of fire and steel, of chaos and courage, when they rode into the heart of an enemy capital and came back out. This would be no slow siege, no weeks of encirclement, no patient strangulation of a city. This would be blunt force trauma, a violent, high-speed, high-risk penetration straight into Baghdad's core. The operation had a name as brutal as its intent, a Thunder Run. But it was more than a code name. It was a philosophy, a doctrine forged in the belief that raw momentum, armored shock, and sheer audacity could break a city's will before its defenders even knew what hit them. The mission wasn't to seize ground or establish outposts. The goal was to drive straight through the Iraqi capital, deep and fast, to deliver a psychological death blow. To show Saddam's forces, his inner circle, and every watching camera in the world that the war was already lost, that American tanks could roll through the streets of Baghdad at will, unchallenged, unstoppable. But for the men inside those tanks and Bradleys, this wasn't just about shock and awe. This wasn't strategy on a PowerPoint slide. This was real war, unpredictable, chaotic, lethal. And they understood exactly what it meant to be at the tip of the spear. For weeks, the coalition had clawed its way north from Kuwait, surging through Iraq's southern heartland. The battles had been fierce. In Basra, British forces had faced tenacious urban resistance. In Nasiriyah, Marines had taken casualties securing bridges and flushing out Iraqi defenders. In Najaf and Karbala, the army had faced ambushes, sniper fire, and a maze of defensive positions. It had been a grinding campaign, marked by speed, but also by blood. The terrain was unforgiving. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of miles, winding through the desert like lifelines waiting to be cut. Convoys faced constant threats, not just from the enemy, but from the land itself. Sandstorms, so thick they turned day into night, had grounded aircraft and blinded tanks. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep vehicles running. Soldiers slept in shifts, rifles within reach, never far from the next engagement. And now they stood at the gates of Baghdad, a city of 5 million, guarded by Saddam's Republican Guard, Ba'ath Party loyalists, and irregular fighters from the Fedayeen Saddam. The capital was a fortress, both symbolic and physical. Command bunkers lay hidden beneath palaces. Surface-to-air missiles ringed its airspace. Bridges had been rigged for demolition. And yet, there was uncertainty. Would Baghdad become another Stalingrad with every street a kill zone? Or would the regime collapse under the weight of its own rot and fear? Intelligence offered conflicting answers. Some reports suggested mass desertions. Others pointed to fanatic resistance. Civilians had fled or hunkered down. No one could say with confidence what lay inside the city. But if the American plan worked, they wouldn't have to find out street by street. They'd punch through the front door and drive straight to the regime's doorstep. Leading the charge was the U.S. Army's 2nd Brigade Combat Team of the 3rd Infantry Division, the Spartan Brigade, under the command of Colonel David Perkins. These were battle-hardened troops, veterans of every fight since crossing the border. Perkins had earned the trust of his men by leading from the front, often positioning his command vehicle near the head of the formation. He knew this mission was as much about psychology as it was about firepower. If they succeeded, it could unravel what remained of Saddam's authority in hours. If they failed, it could leave dozens of vehicles and hundreds of soldiers trapped inside a hostile city with no way out. The assault force was compact but lethal. Roughly 70 armored vehicles, including M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks and M2A3 Bradley fighting vehicles, backed by artillery, engineers, and support elements. This was not an invasion army. It was a knife, honed to a razor's edge, designed to cut deep, fast, and without hesitation. The tanks would lead, flattening resistance with their 120mm cannons and plowing through obstacles. Bradleys would follow, disgorging infantry squads to secure key intersections and eliminate ambushes. Apache helicopters and A-10 Warthogs would provide overwatch from the skies. Every unit had rehearsed the plan, pored over maps, memorized routes. But war has a way of unraveling even the best-laid plans. At 6 a.m. on April 7, 2003, as the sun crept over Baghdad's eastern skyline, engines roared to life. One by one, tanks rumbled forward, their tracks grinding the pavement of Highway 8. The radio net came alive with terse commands. Soldiers gripped their rifles and scanned the rooftops, the overpasses, the alleyways. Somewhere out there, the Fedayeen were waiting. The first kill came within minutes. A truck packed with armed fighters raced toward the column, firing wildly. An Abrams turret rotated with surgical precision, fired once, and the vehicle disintegrated in a blossom of fire and smoke. The message was clear. This wasn't a probe. This was war, and the Americans were not coming to negotiate. As the column advanced deeper into the city, the resistance grew. RPGs streaked from balconies. Machine gun nests opened up from roadside bunkers. The Fedayeen were fanatics, dressed in black, some wearing death shrouds, others camouflaged in civilian clothes. They struck from apartment buildings, mosques, schools. The Americans responded with overwhelming firepower. Tanks leveling buildings, Bradleys shredding insurgents with 25mm cannon fire. The roar of battle echoed through the city's concrete canyons. But still, the column pressed forward. At critical junctions, engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Supply trucks weaved through chaos to deliver ammunition and fuel. Medics treated the wounded in the backs of vehicles as the fight surged around them. It was coordinated violence at its most intense, a moving fortress, punching through the capital one street at a time. For Colonel Perkins and his officers, the city unfolded like a war map brought to life. Landmarks passed by in a blur: Saddam's parade grounds, Ba'ath Party headquarters, the looming shape of the Ministry of Information. The deeper they pushed, the more the illusion of regime control collapsed. By midday, American tanks were rolling past Saddam's palaces. They had punched straight through the regime's heartland and found it hollow. The Thunder Run wasn't just a raid. It was a statement shouted in steel and fire. Baghdad is no longer yours. And yet, even as the brigade regrouped inside the capital, the danger was far from over. The enemy had not surrendered. Ambushes continued. Snipers prowled. But the myth had been shattered. The regime's paralysis was complete. And for the people of Baghdad, watching U.S. tanks thunder down avenues once reserved for Saddam's parades, it was the first undeniable sign that the old order was crumbling. The men prepped in silence. There were no speeches, no battle cries, just the methodical rhythm of soldiers preparing for war. Inside the steel bellies of M1A1 Abrams tanks, crew members hunched over creased, dust-covered maps illuminated by red lens flashlights, tracing the line of advance one final time. Gunner, loader, driver, commander, each man had a role, each man knew the stakes. In the Bradley fighting vehicles, the infantrymen sat shoulder to shoulder, armor-clad and weary-eyed, their gear rattling as the vehicle idled in place. They checked and rechecked their M4 rifles, grenades, spare magazines, and radio headsets. Machine gunners loaded belts with 7.62 rounds, giving them a loving tug to ensure a smooth feed. Grenadiers counted their 40mm shells like rosary beads. The plan, at least on paper, was straightforward. Advance north on Highway 8, carve a steel corridor through the center of Baghdad, punch through the city's outer ring, seize the highway leading west, and strike Saddam International Airport. It was a raid, not an occupation, a thunderclap meant to shatter the regime's sense of control. Strike fast, hit hard, and get out before the defenders could regroup. But everyone in the brigade knew better. Plans collapse the moment the first shot is fired. And this plan demanded they drive into the unknown, into a city of 5 million people, many of whom were armed, angry, and ready to die for Saddam. Baghdad loomed ahead like a riddle wrapped in smoke. The satellite images and intelligence briefings could only say so much. In reality, it was a city built to confuse attackers, a sprawl of narrow alleys, high-rise buildings, walled compounds, underpasses, and overpasses. Every window a potential sniper's perch. Every overpass a possible kill zone. Every pile of rubble could conceal an improvised explosive device. The Iraqis had watched the Americans approach for days. They knew this was coming. They would not be caught off guard. At exactly 0615 hours, the lead Abrams tank of Task Force 164 crossed the dirt berm and roared onto the blacktop of Highway 8. Its turbine engine screamed like a jet engine as it picked up speed. Behind it, more tanks followed, along with a thundering wave of Bradleys, Humvees, and support trucks. The sky was pale orange as dawn stretched over the city. The armor column surged forward, kicking up dust clouds that rolled in their wake. Past burned-out cars, shattered buildings, and empty checkpoints, they moved like an iron spear thrust into the city's side. The first stretch of road was eerily silent. No gunfire, no civilians. Just the ghostly quiet of a city holding its breath. The convoy passed through industrial districts on the southern fringe of Baghdad. Warehouses, oil refineries, concrete plants. Windows stared back at them like empty eyes. Troops scanned rooftops, alleyways, and the horizon. No movement, no resistance. Then came the first crack, a single distant pop of gunfire. Then another. The sound bounced off the concrete buildings, distant but sharp. The silence shattered. Over the radio net, a voice calmly reported, "Contact left," and suddenly the storm began. RPGs erupted from the rooftops in screaming arcs, slamming into the pavement and armored hulls with bone-jarring impact. One struck the side skirt of a Bradley, exploding harmlessly, but sending shock waves through its compartment. Mortar rounds began falling in staggered bursts, cratering the asphalt and splattering debris against hulls. Small arms fire, AK-47s, PKM machine guns, began rattling from windows, rooftops, doorways. It came from all directions, echoing, intensifying, drowning the early morning quiet in a cacophony of war. The Fedayeen were in position. They were dug in, camouflaged, and determined. Some fired from rooftops, while others hid among trees or crouched behind market stalls. Still others blended in with the civilian landscape, stepping out from crowds to fire RPGs before vanishing again. They wore black, often with their faces painted or masked, and attacked with reckless ferocity. Civilians scattered or hit the ground. Some watched in stunned silence as American armor plowed through their neighborhoods like mechanized beasts. But the Americans did not slow. The Abrams tanks responded instantly, their 120mm cannons booming with thunderous force, blasting enemy positions into smoke and rubble. Bradleys barked with their 25mm chain guns, sweeping balconies and alley mouths with deadly bursts. Dismounted infantry moved with surgical precision, clearing choke points, dragging wounded comrades to cover, calling in fire support with practiced urgency. Apache helicopters appeared overhead like steel vultures, their Hellfires and Hydra rockets turning enemy strongpoints into infernos. Still, the resistance intensified. Ambushes sprung from alleys. Car bombs tried to ram the flanks. At one point, a Fedayeen truck packed with explosives barreled toward the column. A tank swiveled its turret and fired at close range, obliterating it in a white-hot flash. The shockwave rocked nearby vehicles, but the column rolled on. Casualties mounted. One tank commander took a sniper round through the hatch. Medics worked under fire to keep him alive. A Bradley hit an RPG on the side armor, disabled but not destroyed. Its crew bailed out, exchanged fire, and were pulled into a nearby vehicle. Dust and smoke choked the roadway. Communications were strained, but the convoy kept pushing, like a fist driving deeper into the city's chest. Even as the Iraqis fought back with desperation, they couldn't stop the momentum. The Americans had speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. They moved like a machine, one part advancing while another suppressed, one part clearing buildings while another set up overwatch. And above it all, the roar of engines, the boom of tank guns, and the shouted commands over headsets stitched the chaos into a grim symphony. By mid-morning, the lead elements of the column had breached the outer city and were approaching the western highway that led to Saddam International Airport. The buildings grew taller, the avenues wider. More civilians appeared, some waving white cloth, others simply staring in disbelief. The regime's propaganda had promised them victory. What they saw instead were foreign tanks driving through the heart of their capital, unstoppable. The Thunder Run had turned Baghdad into a battlefield. The goal wasn't just to destroy, it was to fracture the regime's illusion of control. Every street the Americans crossed was another piece of Saddam's myth crumbling. And though the battle was far from over, the message was already clear. The enemy was no longer at the gates. They were inside. The lead tanks responded with thunderous main gun blasts, turning entire buildings into dust. Bradleys opened up with 25mm cannons, mowing down fighters trying to dart across intersections. It was urban combat in its most brutal form, close, fast, and unrelenting. The column didn't stop. If it did, it would die. The key to survival was momentum. Every second spent stationary increased the risk of being encircled or overwhelmed. Civilians ran for cover. Some waved white cloths, others simply stared in shock as the American armor roared through their neighborhoods like iron beasts. Fires ignited in their wake. Cars burned. Smoke poured from shattered buildings. But the Americans pressed forward, clearing intersections with brutal efficiency. Each tank was a mobile fortress, each infantry squad a fire team ready to dismount and engage threats on foot if needed. At one point, a Bradley took a direct RPG hit to its side. The vehicle shook but kept moving. Inside, the soldiers were rattled but alive. They returned fire, spraying an upper-floor window where the RPG had come from, sending bricks and plaster tumbling onto the street. Nearby, an Abrams rolled over a parked truck rigged with explosives, triggering a deafening explosion that shook the convoy. Shrapnel peppered nearby vehicles, but the formation held. No one broke ranks. All along the route, the Fedayeen Saddam, irregular militia fighters loyal to the regime, emerged from hiding. Dressed in civilian clothes, they fired from windows, alleyways, and even ambulances. The Americans had to be ruthless in response. Any sign of threat was met with overwhelming firepower. Every block was contested. Every intersection was a kill zone. Yet somehow, the 2nd Brigade kept moving. By mid-morning, the convoy had reached its target, Saddam International Airport. The entrance was marked by towering statues and Saddam's likeness. It was a surreal sight, a monument to a dictator now reduced to rubble as Abrams tanks fired shell after shell into the perimeter defenses. Iraqi troops tried to defend the airport but were quickly overwhelmed. Bunkers were crushed. Resistance melted. The Americans seized the airport and raised the U.S. flag. It was a symbolic victory, but they weren't done yet. As noon approached, the brigade received orders to return. This had never been a permanent occupation. It was a raid, a punch to the throat, and it had served its purpose. The message was clear. Baghdad was not safe. The regime could not control its own capital. The myth of Saddam's invincibility had been shattered. The return journey was no less dangerous. Iraqi fighters had regrouped. Roadblocks appeared where the convoy had passed earlier. Fires blocked visibility. Snipers took potshots from rooftops. One tank took a hit and stalled, but was towed under fire by another vehicle, a testament to the discipline and training of the crews. Medics worked furiously on wounded soldiers inside moving Bradleys, treating shrapnel wounds, burns, and trauma. The convoy was bleeding, but it was not breaking. By late afternoon, the battered but victorious formation rolled back into U.S. lines south of the city. They had lost men. They had taken damage. But they had done the impossible. They had driven tanks into the capital of a modern nation-state and lived to tell the tale. The Thunder Run wasn't just a military raid. It was psychological warfare at its finest. That night, news of the armored raid spread across Baghdad. Civilians whispered about the tanks. Iraqi commanders panicked. Saddam's grip weakened further. And inside the White House and Pentagon, a quiet confidence grew. The fall of Baghdad was no longer a question of if, but when. In the days that followed, a second, larger Thunder Run would be launched, this time to stay. But the first Thunder Run would always be remembered as the moment the myth of Saddam's regime began to crumble from within. It showed the world that American forces could, and would, strike deep, fast, and hard. For the men who rolled into Baghdad that morning, it was more than a mission. It was a gauntlet, a trial of nerves, courage, and machine. And it proved, beyond doubt, that the heart of Saddam's Iraq was vulnerable, breakable, and on the verge of collapse.